I make $40,000 a month and my own son has no idea, and tonight, I was about to find out exactly what kind of people he had married into by letting them believe I was nothing more than a fragile, naive old woman with barely enough to get by. Daniel had called me 3 days earlier, his voice unusually cheerful, telling me he wanted me to meet Sophia's parents over dinner at a restaurant I knew well, a place where the wine list alone could intimidate someone who didn't belong. And I remember standing in my closet that evening, running my fingers over tailored jackets and silk blouses before deliberately choosing the simplest outfit I owned, a faded beige cardigan, sensible shoes, and a handbag that had seen better days because appearances, I've learned, are invitations for judgment, and I wanted to see who would accept that invitation without hesitation. The drive into the city was smooth, the skyline glowing against the early evening sky, and as I parked my modest sedan between 2 luxury cars, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, silver hair neatly pinned, face calm, composed, unreadable, and I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I was ready. Inside, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and the soft clink of glassware, and I spotted Daniel immediately, standing beside Sophia near the entrance, both dressed impeccably, both looking like they belonged to a world they assumed I never could. And when Daniel hugged me, it was brief, polite, the kind of hug you give out of obligation rather than warmth, while Sophia offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I noticed how her gaze lingered on my shoes just a second too long before she turned toward the elegantly dressed couple approaching us. "Mom, this is Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel said, his tone carrying a hint of pride I hadn't heard when introducing me to anyone in years, and Mrs. Whitmore's eyes swept over me slowly, methodically, as if she were assessing the value of something she might or might not want to keep, while Mr. Whitmore gave a polite nod, already distracted, already uninterested, and in that brief moment, before a single word about money or status had been spoken, I understood exactly where I stood in their minds. We were led to a table near the center of the room, a place meant to be seen, and as we sat down, I folded my hands neatly in my lap, listening more than speaking, watching every glance, every pause, every subtle shift in tone, because people reveal themselves not in grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces between them. And I had come here not as a guest, but as an observer, someone willing to be underestimated if it meant seeing the truth without disguise. The waiter placed menus in front of us, thick leather covers that suggested prices most people would hesitate to look at twice, and I watched as Mrs. Whitmore did not even glance at hers before speaking, her attention already fixed on me as though I were the most curious item at the table. "So, Margaret," she said, drawing out my name with a politeness that felt rehearsed, "Daniel tells us you live alone." And I nodded gently, offering a small smile. "Yes, I do. It is quieter that way," I replied, keeping my voice soft, measured, the way people expect older women to sound when they assume there is nothing left behind the words, and she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal interest sharpened by judgment. "And what is it that you used to do?" she asked, and there it was, the first test, not of curiosity but of classification, and I could feel Daniel shift slightly in his seat beside me, as if hoping I would not say anything that might embarrass him, which told me more than any answer I could have given. "Oh, I worked in finance for many years," I said simply, leaving out everything that might have changed the direction of her next question, and she let out a small, almost dismissive hum, the kind people make when they have already decided the outcome of a story before hearing it. "That must have been modest," she said, and I smiled again, this time just a fraction slower, because I wanted her to feel comfortable in her assumption, to settle into it, to trust it, while Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, finally engaging. "Retirement can be difficult these days," he added, his tone carrying the weight of someone who believed he understood hardship without ever having truly faced it, "especially if you did not plan ahead." And I folded my hands on the table, noticing how Sophia avoided looking at me entirely, her attention fixed on her glass of water, as if distancing herself from whatever category they were placing me in. And I wondered briefly how long she had allowed them to think of me this way, how many conversations had taken place without me in the room, shaping this version of who I was. "I manage," I said, and that was enough, because people hear what they want in simple words. And Mrs. Whitmore smiled, a satisfied expression that suggested my answer had confirmed everything she believed. "Well, that is good," she replied, though her tone suggested relief rather than respect, as if my managing meant I would not become a burden that might somehow affect her daughter's life. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Daniel is very generous. I am sure he helps when needed." and I turned my eyes to my son just for a moment, long enough to see the hesitation in his expression before he gave a small nod. "Of course," he said, and something inside me settled into a quiet, steady clarity, because that single word told me he had never corrected them, never once chosen to shift their perception of me. And I felt no anger, no immediate reaction, only a deeper awareness, like watching a pattern finally reveal itself after years of being hidden in plain sight. And as the waiter returned to take our orders, Mrs. Whitmore began recommending dishes to me. Simpler ones, less expensive ones, speaking slowly as if explaining to someone unfamiliar with such surroundings, and I listened, nodding when appropriate, letting her guide me through a menu I knew better than she ever would, because tonight was never about the food. It was about understanding exactly how far people would go when they believed they were sitting across from someone who had nothing to offer them. The conversation continued in that same careful rhythm, polite words layered over quiet assumptions, and I noticed how easily they spoke about things that revealed more than they intended. Mrs. Whitmore describing a recent renovation to their second home as if it were a minor inconvenience rather than a luxury most people never experience. Mr. Whitmore mentioning investment portfolios and tax strategies in a tone that suggested expertise, yet lacked the nuance of someone who had truly built wealth from the ground up, and I listened without interrupting, letting their confidence expand into the space I left open, because people tend to fill silence with the truth of who they are. When the appetizers arrived, Sophia finally spoke directly to me, her voice light, almost rehearsed. "I hope this place is not too overwhelming," she said, and I met her eyes, holding her gaze just long enough to register the meaning behind her words before I answered. "It is lovely," I said, and she nodded quickly, relieved, as if she had confirmed something she needed to believe, while Daniel focused on his plate, carefully avoiding any moment that might require him to bridge the growing distance between me and the people he had chosen to align himself with. Then came the next layer, subtle but sharper, Mrs. Whitmore asking if I had considered downsizing to something more manageable, perhaps a smaller apartment or a community with support. Her words wrapped in concern but delivered with the certainty of someone offering a solution to a problem they assumed I could not solve myself, and I tilted my head slightly as if considering her suggestion. Though I had no intention of responding beyond what was necessary. "I have thought about many things over the years," I said, and that was enough to encourage her to continue, because she mistook restraint for agreement. Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying me more openly now. "It is important at your stage of life to have stability," he said, emphasizing the last words as though they carried authority, and I nodded once slowly because I understood what he meant, not stability in the sense of peace or security, but stability as dependence, as predictability, as someone who would not disrupt the order they had already imagined, and I wondered if they realized how clearly they were outlining the role they believed I should play, a quiet, grateful presence, someone who would not question, would not challenge, would not require more than they were willing to give. When the main course arrived, Mrs. Whitmore gently suggested I try something simple, explaining the dish in unnecessary detail, her tone soft but unmistakably condescending, and I thanked her because gratitude often disarms those who expect resistance, and as I took my first bite, I let the moment settle, observing how comfortable they had become, how certain they were of their assessment, and how little it took for them to reveal it, while Daniel laughed at something Mr. Whitmore said, a little too quickly, a little too eagerly, as if approval had become more important than awareness, and I realized then that this evening had already given me everything I needed, not through confrontation or conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of small truths, each one fitting into place until the picture was complete, and I sat there, composed, attentive, allowing them to continue, because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is simply let people believe they are in control long enough for them to show you exactly who they are. By the time the plates were cleared, the tone of the table had shifted from polite curiosity to something more defined, more comfortable in its assumptions, and I could see it in the way Mrs. Whitmore leaned back slightly, no longer evaluating but concluding, as if she had gathered enough evidence to place me neatly into a category that required no further thought, while Mr. Whitmore's questions became less careful, less filtered, moving from suggestion to quiet instruction. At some point it becomes necessary to accept certain realities, he said, folding his hands on the table in a gesture that mimicked authority. Financial limitations, lifestyle adjustments, these are things people in your position have to consider seriously, and I noticed how he spoke not to me but about me, as though I were already an agreed-upon topic rather than a person sitting directly across from him, and I nodded once slowly, giving him the space he clearly expected, because interruption would have disrupted the clarity I was gaining. Sophia glanced at Daniel briefly, a silent exchange that lasted less than a second, but long enough to confirm alignment, and then she added, "We have actually been talking about how to make things easier for everyone." Her voice soft, measured, but carrying the same underlying assumption, and I felt a quiet stillness settle inside me, not discomfort, not even disappointment, but something closer to recognition, the kind that comes when a question you have not asked out loud finally answers itself. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "It is just about planning ahead," he said, choosing his words carefully, but not carefully enough to hide the direction they were all moving toward, and I turned my eyes to him, holding his gaze for a brief moment, long enough for him to feel it, before he looked away, and in that small exchange, I understood that whatever this conversation had been before, it was no longer about introductions or family connections. It had become something else entirely, something structured, intentional. The waiter approached to ask about dessert, and Mrs. Whitmore declined on behalf of the table without consulting me. A small decision, almost insignificant, yet revealing in its ease, and I smiled because these are the moments that matter most, the ones people do not think twice about, the ones that expose how naturally they assume control when they believe there will be no resistance. "You must not want to stay out too late," she said, her tone gentle, final, as if she were closing a conversation rather than participating in one, and I inclined my head slightly, accepting the narrative she had already written for me, because correcting her now would have served no purpose. The truth was far more valuable when revealed at the right time, not the convenient one. As the check was mentioned in passing, I noticed how Mr. Whitmore reached for it without hesitation, not out of generosity, but out of expectation, as though the act of paying confirmed his position within the group, and Daniel did not object, did not offer, simply allowed it to happen, reinforcing a hierarchy that had quietly formed over the course of the evening. And I sat there, calm, composed, fully aware that everything had unfolded exactly as I had intended, because sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that speaks first, but the one that waits, listens, and chooses the moment when silence is no longer necessary. The moment the check was placed on the table, I saw it clearly, not just the bill itself, but the quiet choreography around it, Mr. Whitmore reaching for it with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome, his fingers resting on the leather folder before anyone else had a chance to move, and Daniel did exactly what I expected. He leaned back slightly, offering a polite, almost rehearsed, "You do not have to," while making no real effort to stop him, and Sophia smiled, a small, approving expression that confirmed everything her parents had come to believe about how this evening should end, and I remained still for a moment, watching, allowing the pattern to complete itself, because once a story is fully formed in someone's mind, that is when it is most fragile. Mr. Whitmore opened the folder, glanced at the total, and nodded as if it aligned perfectly with his expectations, and then almost casually he said, "It is only fair, considering," and he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. The implication settled into the space between us, unspoken yet fully understood, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, steady and precise, guiding me toward the moment I had been waiting for. I reached forward then, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but with the same calm deliberation I had carried throughout the evening, and I placed my hand gently over the edge of the folder, just enough to pause his movement without creating resistance, and for the first time since we sat down, the table fell completely silent, not because of anything I had said, but because of what I had done, a small interruption in a sequence they had assumed would remain uninterrupted. "Please," I said softly, my voice even, composed, "allow me," and there was a brief hesitation, a flicker of confusion passing across Mrs. Whitmore's face, while Sophia looked at Daniel as if searching for confirmation that this was unexpected, and Daniel himself seemed caught between instinct and uncertainty, his eyes shifting from me to the check and back again, unsure of how to respond to a situation that did not fit the version of me he had carried for so long. Mr. Whitmore let out a polite chuckle, the kind used to dismiss what he assumed was a misunderstanding. "That is not necessary," he replied, his tone firm but courteous, as though correcting a minor social misstep, and I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to remove any ambiguity from my intention. "I know," I said, and I gently slid the folder toward myself. opening it with the ease of someone entirely familiar with what it contained, and I could feel their attention shift, not dramatically, but enough to register that something was no longer aligning with their expectations. I reached into my handbag, the same worn bag they had already dismissed as insignificant, and withdrew a card, placing it neatly inside the folder before closing it again, and I signaled the waiter with a small, practiced motion, one that required no explanation, and as he approached, I handed him the check without a word, and in that moment, the silence at the table deepened, not with tension, but with realization beginning to form, slow and uncertain, as if each of them were recalculating something they had not considered before, and I sat back in my chair, folding my hands once more, composed, patient, allowing that realization to unfold at its own pace, because the most powerful truths are not the ones you announce, but the ones people discover when everything they believe starts to quietly come undone. The minutes that followed were quiet in a way that could not be mistaken for comfort, and I watched as each of them adjusted, not outwardly at first, but in the small ways that reveal a shift beneath the surface, Mrs. Whitmore straightening her posture just slightly, her fingers smoothing the edge of her napkin as if restoring order to something that had slipped, Mr. Whitmore clearing his throat once, then again, as though searching for a comment that would return the evening to its previous balance, and Sophia finally lifting her eyes toward me with a different kind of attention, not curiosity this time but calculation, as if she were trying to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the one now sitting across from her. Daniel spoke first, his voice careful, almost cautious. "Mom, you really did not have to do that." And I turned to him, meeting his gaze fully, not with accusation, not with warmth, but with a steady clarity that required no explanation. "I know," I said. And the simplicity of the words seemed to unsettle him more than any elaborate answer could have, because there was nothing in them to argue with, nothing to correct, only something to consider. The waiter returned with the receipt, placing it gently beside me, and I signed without hesitation, the motion familiar, practiced, and when I handed the pen back, I noticed how Mr. Whitmore's attention lingered on the card for just a fraction longer than before, as though trying to identify what had changed, what detail he might have missed. But the answer was not in the card itself, it was in the assumption he had made long before it ever reached the table. "Well," Mrs. Whitmore said after a moment, her voice lighter now, almost overly so, "that was very kind of you," and I inclined my head slightly, accepting the comment without reinforcing it, because kindness had never been the point, and I could see that she sensed that, even if she could not yet name it. Sophia leaned forward then, her tone softer, more attentive. "You mentioned you worked in finance," she said, as if revisiting a detail she had previously dismissed, and I nodded once, allowing the conversation to return to a place it had already passed through, but under different circumstances now. "Yes," I replied, and she hesitated, just briefly, before asking, "For a long time?" And there it was, the beginning of recalibration, the first attempt to adjust a narrative that no longer fit as comfortably as it had an hour ago, and I let a small pause settle before answering, not to create suspense, but to give the moment the weight it deserved. "Long enough," I said, and that was all, because precision often carries more impact than detail. Mr. Whitmore shifted in his chair, his earlier certainty replaced with something less defined, and he offered a polite smile that did not quite conceal the question forming behind it. "It must have been rewarding," he said, and I met his gaze again, this time without any need to soften it. "It was," I replied, and the conversation paused once more. Not from lack of words, but from the presence of something new, something they had not accounted for, and as we prepared to leave, chairs sliding back, polite goodbyes beginning to take shape, I remained composed, aware that nothing dramatic had happened, no confrontation, no raised voices, only a quiet shift in understanding, subtle but irreversible, and as I stood, gathering my handbag, I knew that the evening had already revealed more than any direct explanation ever could. Because once people see even a glimpse of the truth they overlooked, they cannot return to the comfort of their original assumptions, no matter how much they might prefer to. We stepped out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, the city lights reflecting softly against the glass doors behind us, and for a moment no one spoke, as if the conversation we had just left behind had followed us outside, lingering in the silence between us, and I could feel it in the way Daniel adjusted his jacket, in the way Sophia lingered half a step behind him, and in the way Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore seemed unsure whether to continue the polite rhythm of the evening or acknowledge the shift that had quietly taken place. "That was unexpected," Mr. Whitmore said finally, His voice measured, as though testing the weight of each word before letting it settle, and I turned slightly toward him, offering a small, neutral smile, not confirming, not denying, simply allowing his observation to exist without resolution, because clarification was no longer my responsibility. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer, her expression softer now, though not entirely at ease. "You should have told us," she said, and there was something in her tone that suggested not concern, but discomfort at having misjudged the situation, and I considered her words briefly before answering. "There was nothing to tell," I said, and she hesitated as if expecting more, as if waiting for me to fill in the gap she was now trying to reconstruct, but I offered nothing further, because the absence of explanation often speaks louder than any justification. Sophia cleared her throat, stepping forward slightly, her voice quieter than before. "We just did not realize," she began, but her sentence trailed off unfinished, and I looked at her with the same calm attention I had maintained all evening, not unkind, but unmistakably aware, and I nodded once, acknowledging what she could not fully articulate, because realization rarely arrives in complete sentences. It comes in fragments, in pauses, in the subtle discomfort of seeing something differently than you did before. Daniel finally met my eyes again, and this time there was no avoidance, only uncertainty. "Mom, why did you not say anything?" he asked, and his question lingered in the air, not accusatory, but searching, and I held his gaze for a moment, long enough for him to feel the weight of what he was asking before I answered. "Because I wanted to listen," I said, and he frowned slightly, as if trying to understand what listening had to do with any of this, and I let the silence settle again, giving him space to think rather than filling it with explanations he was not ready to hear. A car passed by on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the space between us, and in that fleeting brightness I could see it clearly, the shift in how they were looking at me now, not with dismissal, not with quiet judgment, but with a cautious attention that had not been there before, and I knew that nothing I could say in this moment would change what had already been revealed, because the evening had never been about proving anything, it had been about understanding, and understanding, once it settles in, does not require reinforcement. "It was a lovely dinner," I said finally, my voice steady, composed, and I inclined my head slightly, offering the same polite conclusion they had expected at the beginning of the evening, but now carried with a different meaning, and as I turned toward my car, I could feel their eyes follow me, not out of curiosity but out of recognition, as if they were beginning to see not just who I was, but who they had assumed I was, and the distance between those two things, and I walked forward without hesitation because sometimes the most powerful statement is not what you say when everything becomes clear, but what you choose not to say at all. I drove home in silence, the city gradually giving way to quieter streets, and the rhythm of the road beneath me felt steady, almost grounding, as if each passing mile was placing distance not just between me and that dinner, but between what had been assumed and what had now been seen. And when I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it, calm, unchanged, a place that had never needed to prove anything to anyone. I stepped inside, setting my handbag gently on the table, and for a moment I remained still, letting the quiet settle around me, because silence, when it is chosen, feels very different from silence that is imposed, and tonight had reminded me of that distinction in a way I had not considered in years. I moved through the familiar rooms, turning on a single lamp, the soft light filling the space without overwhelming it, and I thought about the expressions I had seen across that table, how quickly certainty had shifted into hesitation, how confidence had given way to questions no one had been prepared to ask, and I understood something then that had nothing to do with money or status, something simpler, more enduring, that respect is rarely about what you have, but almost always about what others believe you lack. My phone buzzed on the counter, the sound cutting cleanly through the quiet, and I glanced at the screen to see Daniel's name, and for a brief moment, I considered letting it go unanswered, not out of avoidance, but because some conversations require space before they can be understood, but I answered anyway, lifting the phone with the same calm I had carried all evening. "Mom," he said, his voice different now, stripped of the ease it had held before dinner, replaced by something more careful, more aware. "I have been thinking about tonight," and I did not respond immediately, allowing him to continue because listening, I had learned, often reveals more than speaking ever could. "I did not realize," he added, and then paused, as if searching for the right words and finding none that felt sufficient, and I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration but in Recognition, because realization is rarely clean, it arrives unevenly, in fragments that take time to form something complete. That is all right, I said, and my voice remained steady, not dismissive, not comforting, simply present, and there was a long pause on the other end, the kind that carries more meaning than anything spoken, and then he asked quietly, "Why did you let them think that?" And I leaned back slightly, looking out toward the darkened window, where my reflection stared back at me, calm, unchanged, and I answered without hesitation, because I needed to see how they treat someone they believe cannot offer them anything. And the words settled between us, clear, unembellished, and I could feel him absorbing them, not fully understanding yet, but beginning to, and that was enough. After we ended the call, I placed the phone down and stood there for a moment longer, aware that nothing had been forced, nothing had been declared, only revealed, and that is often the difference between being heard and being understood. And as I turned off the light and prepared for the night, I felt no urgency to explain further, no need to revisit the evening in detail, because the truth had already done its work quietly, precisely, and in ways that would continue to unfold long after the conversation had ended. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight filtering through the curtains in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the world had decided to remain unchanged despite everything that had shifted beneath the surface the night before. And I moved through my routine with the same steady rhythm, preparing coffee, setting a cup by the window, allowing the familiar details of the morning to settle around me, because consistency has a way of clarifying what truly matters. As I sat down, I thought again about the dinner, not the words themselves, but the spaces between them, the glances, the assumptions, the ease with which people had defined me without ever asking who I was, and I realized that none of it had been personal in the way people often believe. It had been habitual, learned behavior, the quiet tendency to measure others based on what can be seen rather than what is understood, and that realization removed any lingering weight from the evening, leaving only clarity behind. My phone remained silent this time, and I did not expect it to ring, because some conversations do not continue immediately, they unfold slowly, in the way people think, in the way they remember, in the way they begin to question things they once accepted without hesitation, and I knew Daniel would need time. Not to hear more from me, but to hear himself more clearly. Later that afternoon I stepped outside, the air crisp, carrying the subtle promise of a new season, and as I walked along the quiet street, I noticed how little had changed externally. The same houses, the same passing cars, the same distant sounds of everyday life, and yet everything felt slightly different, not because the world had shifted, but because my understanding of it had deepened, and there is a quiet strength in that. A kind of certainty that does not require validation. When I returned home, there was a message waiting, not a call this time, but a simple text from Daniel, brief, direct, and more thoughtful than anything he had said the night before. "I understand now, or at least I am starting to," and I read it once, then again, not searching for hidden meaning but acknowledging the effort it represented, because understanding is rarely immediate, it is built piece by piece, and I set the phone down without replying right away, allowing his words to exist on their own without rushing to respond or guide them further. I walked into the living room and paused for a moment, looking around at the space I had built over the years, every detail chosen intentionally, every corner reflecting a life that had never needed to be explained to anyone else, and I felt a quiet sense of completeness, not from what had happened, but from what had been revealed, because sometimes the most important truths are not the ones that change others, but the ones that confirm who you have been all along. And as the day moved forward, steady and unremarkable in the best possible way, I carried that clarity with me, not as something to hold on to, but as something that no longer needed to be questioned, because I had seen what I needed to see, and more importantly, I had allowed others to see it too, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the simple act of letting them believe exactly what they chose, until the moment that belief could no longer hold.